Dr. Dalia Fahmy, thank you so much for being with us and welcome to Doha Forum. You spoke earlier today about the selective application of international law, something the West often likes to tout as something they're beholden to, but we've seen a lot of hypocrisy in the last few months coming out of those corridors. Can you explain more what you mean by selective application?
So international law and the rule of law in the international realm was established for the protection of humanity, but for the establishment of peace and justice. When we look at states that are brought, for example, before the ICC, there's usually middle range and poor states. If you look at those who are prosecuted for atrocities, it's usually African countries. If we look at the norms of the international community and who violates them and who gets punished or penalized for violating them, it's usually poorer countries. And so the selective application of international law is really in that regard. What we saw last year happen in Ukraine and this year happen in Gaza, we have yet to see a resolution emerge on either. If we look at what's happening, for example, to the Uyghurs in China, we have yet to see a resolution emerge from the Security Council on China. Why? Because of the power of the P5. And so that is the heart of the selective application, is that we can have what many are regarding a genocide occurring and the international community not responding. Just this morning, the Secretary General of the United Nations reiterated what he said on Friday when he invoked Article 99, calling for a ceasefire. And the reason why is he said it has to be on humanitarian grounds, because he said there's not a single place in Gaza that is safe. There's not a single place that is safe for humanitarian resources to reach the civilian population. 124 members of the UN staff of UNRWA have been killed. And so when he calls for the most basic human right to be abided by, this Article 99, and for the United States to veto it, and to veto it with such confidence that you know how we're going to vote, and the international community is going to be paralyzed because of our vote, and atrocities can continue, is really quite telling about the level of unjust application of international law when it comes to humanitarian situations.
In an increasingly multipolar world, do you think that we will be able to see that power of the P5 be checked in the future?
We have talked about UN reform for quite a while, and we're very far from doing that. And so it's going to take a collective movement away from the norms of engagement of today into norms of engagement that really do uphold the Charter on Human Rights. So next year is the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. And 75 years later, in 2023, we are still not applying the basic rules that everyone has agreed to, or we apply it selectively, or punishment is selective. And so there is room, insofar as the international community is willing to actually have these difficult conversations about what is real human security.
Speaking of the U.S. vote at the UN Security Council, obviously the U.S. is isolated on the world stage right now for its allegiance to Israel. We have a U.S. presidential election coming up next year. How is the Muslim vote in America turning as a result of this unbridled allegiance to Israel?
I'm not sure the Muslim vote is seen yet as unbridled allegiance to Israel, as much as it is the complete disregard for Palestinian life, Palestinian rights, and a humanitarian crisis, and the level of injustice that's allowed to happen on our watch. So it's not so much about allegiance to Israel as the dehumanization of Palestinians. So in the 2020 election, what we saw, and so my colleagues and I have produced a study, is that in the 5 key swing states, that in the Democratic vote, Muslims became the heart of the Democratic vote. And it's just 2020. And here we are 3 years later, where Muslims are abandoning the DNC, or the Democratic National Committee, or the Democratic Party, because of this carte blanche disregard of a very human issue that many Muslims are very puzzled about. And so the Biden administration needs 2 pools. It needs young people to vote for President Biden next year, and it needs minority groups who have stood by him for at least the past 20 years in office. And what we're seeing happening today is the abandonment of President Biden by young people and also by Muslim Americans. And so in the past 2 weeks, we have seen his statements shift a little. in, well, Israel needs to behave protecting or human life in Gaza, it's not enough to determine whether or not he will win the next election in terms of this vote, but we're still a year away, and so we will see.
How does the dehumanization of Palestinians shape international perspectives?
I teach a course on genocide. Yeah, I teach a course on genocide. And one of the stages of genocide that happens pretty early on is the narrative of dehumanization. And we see the narrative of dehumanization applied today to the people of Gaza, extending it to all Palestinians, and in some regard, many different Muslim communities. The narrative of dehumanization that emerged, for example, in the 2016 Republican primary that led to the election of President Trump, led to an uptick in violence that was unprecedented in the United States. And so when President Trump came into office and instituted the Muslim ban, that very same day, a mosque was burnt down in Texas, and 2 people were shot and killed in Michigan for being Muslim. And so dehumanizing narratives that were just at that time, we need to round up Muslims because we're not sure what they're doing, is nothing compared to the narrative of dehumanization we're seeing today. And so the level of violence, not just in Gaza, but it's happening to Arabs and Muslims throughout the world today because of the acceptance of the narrative of dehumanization, is quite telling. And when we look at it as the second stage of genocide, it really begs the question of where is the international community today?
Have you seen your students as a whole over the years you've been teaching? Have you seen their opinions on not just this current conflict, but conflicts in the Middle East in general change due to a rise in, let's say, the prominence of networks like Aljazeera or content creators or influencers?
In the past few weeks, I have seen students ask me questions like, I've seen this on TikTok, is it true? Or is there a narrative of dehumanization occurring against mothers who, there's I guess a genre of mocking Palestinian mothers who are crying over their children. And I was puzzled that students were picking something up that I was completely unaware of. And when we look at this alternate media, we think of the major cable networks in the United States as where you consume all of your news sources. But today, the power of social media and influencers and alternative media has opened students' eyes to a reality they want to question, that they no longer want to take for granted. And of course, as an educator, you welcome the question, you welcome the dialogue. It's actually what the Doha Forum is all about. And so for students to be puzzled by, wait, we've learned this historically, but I'm seeing this other narrative. How do I make sense? How do I put them in dialogue? Is probably one of the silver linings of not just this conflict. You saw it during the Arab Spring, right? With kind of explosion of reading tweets. Historically, in the advent of the radio, and before that, the printing press. That in every generation, there is a medium that emerges that challenges the status quo. And we're definitely seeing that today.
How difficult is it to teach in such a hyper-polarized environment?
So as an educator, I feel that my job is to create a safe space for students to ask any kind of question, and to do so with a level of dignity of all the others in the class. Because if we can't ask difficult questions in a safe space like a classroom, then where else are you going to ask them? Because the heart of education is about teaching students how to think. And if you can't ask questions that make us uncomfortable, well, are we really growing? You know, I ask students, I teach one course on politics of the Middle East, and I tell them, look, at some point, each of you will be uncomfortable with what you're reading or what you're hearing. And that level of discomfort is actually called learning, because either something that you took for granted is being challenged, and one of two things can happen. You might actually find more evidence for your position, or you might find evidence that maybe runs counter to your position that you find compelling. And that is called learning. And so the institution of higher education, academic freedom, is really about challenging ourselves and our students in these moments of crisis. Because if we're going to teach them how to think about what their role in the future is, then we can't ignore what's happening today.
Dialogue is critical, as we can tell by this forum. That's what we're here to do, and to solve world problems. But with this hyperpolarity and with these learned narratives, I think it's easier for people to tweet something, to post something, than it is to have those difficult conversations. How can we help overcome that and get ourselves into that uncomfortable space?
Well, what I tell students is that if you don't ask these questions now, where are you going to ask them? If we don't make the mistakes in having difficult conversations today, we're never going to have them. And so I really believe, as educators or as facilitators of meetings like this, creating this space to ask difficult questions, where you might even make a mistake, is critical and fundamental to development and to learning. And we've become a society and a culture that's uncomfortable with getting uncomfortable. And if we don't move out of that, we possibly can be allergic to having these difficult conversations in the future. And so again, as an educator, I find it my job to create safe spaces of dialogue so that you can ask anything and come up together with a collective, not answer, but gateway or pathway to where we can get our answers.
Dr. Dalia Fahmy, thank you very much for being with us.